So the last little bit of Chapter 6 involves two things really, interpreting seasonal indices and correcting for seasonality. So the first part that you need to be able to do is to be able to look at a seasonal index and interpret what that means in terms of the context of the story. So for this particular example here, it's giving us sales figures and seasonal indices for 12 months of a year. So as you look through, the seasonal index for January is 1.2, and basically you need to be able to understand that a seasonal index of 1.2 means that the monthly sales figures for January are typically 20% above the expected average monthly sales figures. Similarly, if you were looking at February, a figure of 1.2 for the seasonal index basically means that sales for February are typically 30% above the expected average monthly sales figures. Something like November, so a seasonal index of 1.1, means sales for November are typically 10% above average monthly sales. On the other hand, if you had a seasonal index of 1, so April, for example, if you were interpreting that figure, you'd be looking and saying that monthly sales figures for April are typically average. So any seasonal index of 1 means it is average for that particular month. Anything that is above 1 means sales for that particular month are above average. Anything that is below 1 means typically the sales figures are below average. So if you're looking at something like July, having a seasonal index of 0.8, that would mean that typically sales for July are 20% below average monthly sales figures. Something like August, seasonal index of 0.7, sales figures for August are typically 30% below average monthly sales figures. So number one, you have to be able to identify and interpret what a particular seasonal index means. Number two, you need to be able to figure out how to correct seasonality. So if you're shown that same figure there, January figure of seasonal index of 1.2, as we've already discovered, that means January sales are 20% above average for that particular year. So what you would need to do to correct that, because it's above average, it means you need to decrease your sales. Okay, if you're looking at August, for example, and you know that those sales are below average, then to correct that, you need to increase your sales. If you have a seasonal index of 1, looking at April or October, and May even, and you are asked to correct that, you don't need to do anything. So the sales figures are average already, so you don't need to adjust them at all. So anything above 1, you need to decrease. Anything below 1, you need to increase. And anything that actually is 1, you need to just leave it as it is. Okay, so the tricky part of this is not that bit. The tricky part is deciding how much we need to increase or decrease by. It's not quite as simple as it would seem. So I guess the trick is understanding that if you've got a sales figure for, say, January that's 20% above average, and you understand you need to decrease the sales, you don't decrease them by 20%. So we need to figure that out. That's always a trick question in an Exam 1 exam. They'll always say if you've got a seasonal index of 1.2, you need to do what? And you'll have 5 little options. Definitely one of them will be decreased by 20%. That is the trick answer, so don't pick that one. It's never, ever the same percentage as what you think it should be. So we need to use the little formula there, and we are looking at figuring out the increase or decrease by looking at what's the difference between what the seasonal index actually is and 1, which is the average, and then dividing that by the actual and making it into a percentage. So for the example we've used, the January one, the seasonal index is 1.2. We're figuring out here the difference between 1.2 and the actual average. We know that's 0.2. And we're going to divide that by the actual figure that was 1.2, and we're going to make that into a percentage. When we do that calculation, we need to decrease our sales by 17%. Okay, so when you're looking and thinking to correct a seasonal index of 1.2, I know I need to decrease it. I need to do a calculation to figure out what I need to decrease it by. If you flip over the page, there's corrections and how to do it. So just to quickly walk you through those things there. A seasonal index of 1.03 means sales for that particular season in summer are typically 3% above average sales. So then, because they're above average, you should understand that you need to first of all decrease, and then you need to calculate to find the percentage. So if you, in your calculator here, do the difference between what the seasonal index actually is and 1, and then divide it by the seasonal index, change that into a percentage, you'll get 2.91%. So to correct seasonality for summer with a seasonal index of 1.03, you should decrease your sales by 2.91%. And it goes through, the page there gives you 4 examples, autumn being 1.15, so 15% above average, so I know I've got to decrease. Then I do the calculation to find out by how much. So I need to correct the seasonality for autumn. I need to decrease my sales by 13.04%. Same for winter. The seasonal index is 1.3, so it's above average, so I know I've got to decrease. And then to find the decrease, I do the percentage calculation. So the difference between the average, which is 1, and the seasonal index, which is 1.3, divided by 1.3, made into a percentage. So if I was going to correct the seasonality for winter, I know I've got to decrease my sales by 23.08%. The last one is the summer figure, and it's a 0.52. So if I was interpreting 0.52 seasonal index, I basically have to say the sales for summer are typically 48% below average sales. So because they're below average, I need to increase this time. Still do the same calculation. I still find out what's the difference between average and the seasonal index. So 1 and 0.52, find the difference, divide by 0.52 and make into a percentage. So to correct the seasonality for a season that's got a seasonal index of 0.52, I know I need to increase my sales by 92.31%. So if you flip onto the next page, there's a whole lot of examples to try. I think I might leave the answers for the next video. So if you can work through the examples on page 30, have a play with those for starters. The first example there is an exam question, an exam 1 question, really typical one. And then there's an example there with some fill in the gap type arrangements. Remember here, when you're trying to calculate a missing seasonal index, there's 4 seasons, so the sum of the 4 seasonal indexes would be 4. So you've got to figure out what's the missing number if you're saying 0.5 plus 1 plus 1.3. So to figure out what that missing little seasonal index is there, you need to do a calculation first of all. And then you've also got to remember to get a deseasonalized figure here, we need to calculate actual divided by the seasonal index. So you need to do a bit of calculating before you actually work out the rest of the answers. So have a play with those, there's a whole lot of how would you interpret the seasonal index, how would you correct the seasonal index. So a lot of those are just repetitive questions just to get that skill down pat. So try those. I'll come back in the next video and give you the answers for those few examples.